have you ever considered that beyond, the big headlines, the politicians, the rhetoric, there might be something else, something more fundamental driving things, an unseen force, maybe?
It's a fascinating thought, isn't it?
Yeah, and today we're taking a deep dive into an idea that, well, it's definitely fascinating, maybe a bit unsettling too. It could really shift how you look at history. Okay, let's unpack this. What if historical cycles, specifically cycles tied to the sun, are the real drivers, affecting economies, sparking revolutions, even wars?
What's fascinating here is the source we're looking at today. It's a recent newsletter from the Macro Butler, and it's titled The Solar War Syndrome.
Right.
And it puts forward this idea that these solar cycles, the roughly 11-year patterns of solar activity, sunspots, flares, maybe they're the real puppeteers pulling the strings of history. So our mission here is to pull out the key takeaways, the surprising bits from this perspective, and help you figure out what it might mean for, well, everything that's happening right now.
Exactly. So over the next few minutes, we'll explore how these solar cycles are supposedly influencing, well, almost everything. Economies, conflicts. We'll look at the historical patterns the source highlights, try to connect them to current events, and then dive into the geopolitical game that this analysis says is playing out. And ultimately ask, what does this mean for you? So let's start with that core idea from the Macro Butler cycles rule history, not politicians. And the sun. It's been this unseen puppeteer for ages. It's a pretty big claim.
It is, but the source, the solar war syndrome, it lays out some historical points. It argues that things like GDP growth, interest rates, inflation, even commodity markets, they all seem to, as it puts it, dance to the rhythms of solar activity. But it's not just finance. The claim is the sun has ignited revolutions, toppled empires. Think about this. The source points to major solar intensity spikes lining up with world-changing events. Like the Paris Commune in 1871. That was during solar cycle 11. Then you have the Russian revolutions, spanning cycles 14 and 15. And even the fall of the Soviet Union. That happened right around the peak of cycle 22.
Wow. And more recently?
Well, the Arab Spring, that huge wave of uprisings across the Middle East, the source connects it directly to the climax of solar cycle 24. The Macro Butler doesn't mince words, saying the sun has been moonlighting as history's most consistent economic hitman, and its next job may already be booked.
That's quite a statement. But you look at the patterns presented, and they are, well, undeniably there. It makes you wonder if history isn't just repeating, but maybe it's solar-powered.
So bringing it to today, the sun's heading towards a minimum maybe around July 2025. But just before that, solar cycle 25 has been ramping up towards its peak, expected around October 2024. And the Macro Butler suggests, here we go again, the world's trembling. Revolutions, unrest, acts of terror.
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting, because the source links this directly to recent events, like October 7th, 2023. Cycle 25 was surging, and Hamas attacks Israel. The source calls it Israel's 9/11.
And it highlights the timing. 9/11 was just before cycle 23's peak. October 7th, roughly a year before cycle 25's projected peak. It sees a pattern there.
And then the fallout, the escalation in the Middle East, Israel's response involving Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iran. The source says it echoes the post-9/11 invasions. And it's not just the Middle East, is it?
No, exactly. The Moscow Crocus City Hall attack, March 2024, ISIS-linked. The source uses this to argue the violence isn't contained. It says during these solar peaks, the world didn't just heat up, it burned.
Intense.
And then you see these revolutions and leadership changes fitting the narrative, according to the source. August 2024, Bangladesh. Sunspot activity peaks for the month just before the overall cycle maximum, and boom, revolution. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina ousted.
Suddenly.
Right. Very suddenly. Draws parallels to Sri Lanka in 2022, echoes of the Arab Spring during cycle 24's peak. And there's this detail: Hasina reportedly flees to India, a power many protesters resisted, similar to Ukraine's Yanukovych fleeing to Russia in 2014. Then came reports, accusations of minority rights issues, which the source notes mirrored justifications used elsewhere. Then December 2024, the Assad regime in Syria. Considered unshakable for so long, it collapses. The source asks, is history repeating or escalating? Remembering ISIL's rise back in 2014, also at cycle 24's peak.
And it's not just conflict. The source talks about migration, too.
Yes, mass migration surges. It references a Russian scientist, Jasevsky, who apparently found decades ago that solar maximums often coincide with these huge movements of people.
Okay.
And today, the source argues it's happening again. Migration into the U.S., into Europe. Surging as cycle 25 climbed. It became a huge election issue, didn't it? Mentioning Trump's win in November 2024, almost perfectly timed with the solar maximum. So yeah, the question becomes, what does this all mean geopolitically?
Right, the bigger picture.
Well, the Macro Butler talks about an inevitable escalation of war in the Middle East. It specifically points to hypothetical Israeli strikes against Iran, mentioning dates like June 13 and June 21st, 2025.
And the source is pretty cynical about the motivations behind that, isn't it?
Very cynical. It questions Israel's stated reasons, like stopping a bomb, suggesting it could be about, say, undermining a potential Trump peace deal, or maybe linked to Netanyahu surviving a no-confidence vote around that time. It also criticizes potential U.S. involvement, using terms like bombing a sovereign nation during peak solar flare season and warmonger-in-chief.
And it mentioned this idea of a neocon cabal.
Yes, that term is used. It links Netanyahu to figures like William Crystal, suggesting a shared goal, historically, of removing leaders like Saddam, Assad, Gaddafi, tying it back to things like the Iraq War and CIA operations. The force basically argues politicians sometimes use foreign conflicts to distract from domestic issues. Think Argentina and the Falklands, Yeltsin in Chechnya, Putin in Crimea, Bush in Iraq. That pattern.
So, the West is entangled, but the analysis suggests someone else might be pulling strings, or at least benefiting.
Exactly. It points east, saying the real puppet master may be sitting quietly, watching the West burn itself out. It's talking about China.
How so?
The Macro Butler claims that while official numbers might show zero Iranian oil imports to China, the reality on the ground, according to energy researchers cited, is different. Iranian oil allegedly flows via shadowy transshipment routes using middlemen, places like Malaysia. So China is seen as silently fueling the chaos. And this is happening while internally, the source suggests Xi Jinping might be facing challenges, mentioning purges in the party and the military, and the rise of what it calls China's neocons. The overall picture, a global unraveling under a raging sun. History escalating, not just repeating.
Okay, but then there's a twist, right? Something the source says isn't being widely reported.
That's right. While everyone's focused on sea lanes, like the Strait of Hormuz, the analysis claims China and Iran have built a kind of escape hatch.
An escape hatch?
Yeah, the old Silk Road, but reborn with railways. Specifically, the China-Iran railway link. It goes through Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, into Iran, the KTI railway. Finalized back in 2013, supposedly fully operational now.
Okay, so an overland route.
Exactly. It bypasses those maritime choke points, Hormuz, Suez. The source argues this makes Iran's energy supply less vulnerable and reduces China's dependence on those sea lanes. It even compares it to how ancient Antioch got rich from the original Silk Road.
It's described as brilliant asymmetrical logistics because, like the source says, trains don't sail through bottlenecks. That's quite a point.
It really is. It implies that even if the Strait of Hormuz closed, it wouldn't necessarily cripple China or Iran because they have this alternative.
So who would be hurt in that scenario, according to this analysis?
The source suggests the real losers would be countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who are still heavily dependent on the strait for their oil exports. So this rail line, it argues, gives Iran leverage, keys to a strait that can strangle its enemies while barely touching its friends. It really changes how you might think about the power dynamics there.
Okay, so given all this potential for conflict, how does the source see war spreading? It uses the analogy of a virus.
Yeah, spreads like a bad virus. It outlines a few ways. First, alliance entanglements, like how the assassination of an archduke led to World War I. It flags NATO's potential role today in escalating local issues.
Right.
Second, ideology and revolution. Think American and French revolutions, 1848, Marxism spreading after 1917 in Russia to inspire revolution in Germany. Third, nationalism and ethnic ties, using the breakup of Yugoslavia as an example.
And the biggest risk today, according to the source.
Religion. Specifically, the danger of the Iran-Israel conflict being framed purely as a religious war.
That sounds incredibly dangerous.
It does. The source draws a parallel to the Protestant Reformation. In the 1500s, economic trouble meant new tech, printing press, and religious ideas, leading to massive upheaval. The warning is clear. If Iran-Israel is seen as Islam versus Israel instead of government versus government, it will blow up in everyone's face, especially considering Europe's large and growing Muslim population.
And the Sunni-Shia split plays into this.
It's part of the background, definitely. Ancient roots, deepened now by geopolitics like the Iran-Saudi rivalry. But the source also notes many Muslims identify more broadly than just that split. The main takeaway is that war spreads contagiously, and while it's not inevitable, the current fault lines are pretty alarming.
So we have solar cycles, geopolitical chaos. What does the Macro Butler say this means for, well, us, for our investments, our grasp on reality?
It brings up Major General Smedley Butler, his 1935 book, War is a Racket. Butler was highly decorated, but he basically argued war was mostly about profit for big business and banks, not defense.
Right, the military-industrial complex idea, essentially, but earlier.
Exactly. Butler outlined lobbying for war, profiteering during, profiteering after. His solution, radically simple. Take the profit out, conscript wealth along with soldiers, cap profits, limit deployments. Only let those eligible for frontline duty vote on war. Pretty strong stuff.
Definitely. And how does this connect to investment performance during wars? The source sees patterns there, too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty clearly laid out. During Vietnam, 55 to 75, and the Second Gulf War, 03 to 11, gold apparently beat the Dow by more than 3 times. And since February 2022, which the source frames as the start of the U.S.-Russia conflict, gold and equities have beaten cash and bonds.
So given the source's outlook solar cycles, escalating conflict, what are the key financial takeaways for someone trying to navigate this?
The big one is that rates tend to rise during wartime, even if central banks try to push them down. It's bad news for long-term bondholders. Mortgage rates, car loan rates go up. The source warns about an inflationary bust or stagflation coming. The message is blunt. Goldilocks is gone. Golden lots is the new survival playbook.
Okay, so if Goldilocks is gone, what's the survival guide look like? The source has some don'ts.
It does, framed a bit tongue-in-cheek. But the points are serious. First, don't park wealth in banks. It warns about potential bail-ins or asset freezes in extreme times. Second, don't cling to sovereign bonds. Governments under pressure might default. Third, don't assume inflation erases debt. High interest rates or loan indexation can counteract that.
And the DOs, for what it calls smart money.
Right, the DOs. Do stack physical gold and silver. Stored securely, maybe offshore, non-confiscable. Do assume governments might try to grab assets. Cites historical examples like FDR, Greece, Iceland. Do spread wealth across borders, maybe a second residence or passport. Do shift focus from return on capital to return of capital. Protecting your principal becomes key.
Makes sense in uncertain times.
Also, do get cozy with defense stocks. If governments are gearing up, well. And do rethink the permanent portfolio. Hike gold allocation way up, maybe over 25%. Add silver, platinum, copper, oil, agriculture. And finally, limit cash to maybe 10–20%. Keep it in short-term, high-quality U.S. dollar corporate bonds for flexibility.
So we've covered a lot here. This deep dive into the Macro Butler solar war syndrome presents this really provocative idea of solar cycles as a major, maybe the major hidden force in history, affecting economies, politics, conflict.
It really makes you think differently about the connections, doesn't it? Between the sun, events on Earth, even financial markets.
Absolutely. And it pushes you to question the standard narratives.
And this raises that important question.
Right.
What does it mean for how we see the world? The source emphasizes understanding the real enemy isn't necessarily other people, but the warmongers in power.
Which brings us back to that sobering quote the source uses from Plato, "Only the dead have seen the end of war." It definitely gives you pause.
It does. But the deep dive isn't just a warning. It's also suggesting that understanding these potential challenges, this different view of history, can help you prepare, preserve wealth, maybe even find opportunities. The idea is that by recognizing these forces, maybe you can navigate the turbulence and be ready for whatever comes next, perhaps even a new era of opportunity.
Food for thought, definitely. Something for you, the listener, to consider as you watch events unfold.